The training hall smelled of metal and ozone, the air heavy with the hum of equipment and the occasional clang of sparring weapons. Will Kade rolled his shoulders, adjusting his grip on the practice staff. Across from him, Rilvek shifted uneasily, his four eyes narrowing as he studied the human stance. "This is a terrible idea," Rilvek muttered, his mandibles clicking with uncertainty. "You're the one who wanted to see how humans fight," Will replied, shaking out his arms. "I told you, I'm not going easy just because you've got an exoskeleton." A small crowd of alien students had gathered around the sparring mat, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright concern. Will was the only human in the interspecies combat training program, and he had already gained a reputation for being reckless. Not because he was careless, he just didn't know when to back down. Instructor Joran, a towering reptilian veteran, flicked his tail against the ground. "Begin." Rilvek moved first, his two upper arms spinning his staff in a blur. Will sidestepped the first strike and deflected the second, his grip tightening as he aimed a quick counter to Rilvek's side. The alien blocked it with ease, his chitinous plating absorbing the impact. The fight escalated quickly. Rilvek was faster, but Will was unpredictable. He ducked under a wide swing and struck low, forcing Rilvek to stumble back. The gathered students murmured in surprise. Then it happened. Will miscalculated his next move. He stepped in too close, and Rilvek, reacting on instinct, slammed his staff forward with a force that was meant to push Will back. Instead, it connected awkwardly against Will's forearm with a sickening crack. The room went silent. Will staggered, his face contorting as he clutched his arm. His fingers twitched, his breath came in short, ragged bursts. The pain was immediate, sharp, searing. He knew without looking that something was very wrong. Rilvek dropped his weapon, stepping back in horror. "You." Will exhaled sharply, his vision going white at the edges, but he forced himself to stay upright. His arm hung at an unnatural angle, but he grit his teeth and adjusted his stance. "I'm not done," he said, voice tight. The aliens watching recoiled. Joran took a step forward. "Kade, stand down. Your arm is broken." Will swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. Sweat beaded on his forehead, nausea creeping up his throat. "Yeah, I noticed." He flexed his good hand. His body screamed at him to stop, to sit down, to do anything but keep going. But he wasn't about to walk away now. Rilvek's mandibles trembled. "You should not be standing. That level of trauma." "I've had worse," Will lied. One of the students, a blue-skinned Silari named Pash, turned to Joran. Human biology cannot sustain that level of damage while continuing combat. He should be in shock. Joran's expression was unreadable. Humans are strange. Will took a deep breath, his knees threatening to buckle. The pain hadn't lessened, it was getting worse. His fingers were starting to tingle, and he knew he was pushing his luck. Joran exhaled through his nostrils. "Enough. Kade, medical bay. Now." Will hesitated. His body was already deciding for him, his vision swimming. He swayed slightly, and Rilvek moved forward as if to catch him. "I can walk," Will muttered, though his legs disagreed. The gathered students parted as he stumbled toward the exit, his breath hitching with every step. His broken arm throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his body. Rilvek followed, his posture rigid with guilt. "I did not intend." "I know," Will interrupted. He didn't have the energy to say more. By the time they reached the medical bay, Will was barely holding himself together. The pain was unbearable now, his face pale and clammy. The station's medical officer, a stern-looking Avexian named Dr. Velora, took one look at him and scowled. "Sit, now." Will gratefully collapsed onto the nearest examination table, his breath shallow. Velora scanned his arm, her expression darkening. Severe radial and ulnar fractures. Possible nerve damage. She turned to Rilvek, her eyes narrowing. "How hard did you hit him?" Rilvek's mandibles twitched. Not hard enough that he should still be conscious. Will let out a weak laugh, then immediately regretted it as his vision blurred from the pain. Velora muttered something under her breath and pressed a hypospray against his neck. The sharp hiss was followed by a wave of dizziness, and he barely had time to process it before his body went slack. Finally, Velora said, exasperated, "Humans, always pushing until they break." Rilvek exhaled slowly. He was already broken. Velora sighed. "Exactly my point." Will's awareness returned in pieces. First the sterile scent of antiseptics, then the soft hum of medical equipment. The steady pressure wrapped around his arm registered last, a dull ache replacing the sharp agony from before. His fingers twitched experimentally, and a muted throb answered. Manageable. A shadow loomed over him. Velora, ever unimpressed, adjusted a monitor with practiced efficiency. Her sharp-eyed gaze flicked to his face, her exasperation evident. "You're awake." "Unfortunately." Will tried to push himself upright, but Velora's hand landed firmly on his shoulder, keeping him still. "Don't test me, Kade." Movement at the edge of his vision drew his attention. Rilvek stood stiffly near the door, his posture betraying unease. His mandibles twitched in something close to hesitation, his upper hands clasped together in a way that Will suspected meant guilt. Will exhaled and shifted carefully, testing the limits of his arm. The brace locked it in place, restricting movement. Given how bad it had been, he was lucky it was still attached. Rilvek took a step closer, his voice carrying an edge of restrained tension. "You should not have continued the fight." Velora scoffed, not looking up from her work. Finally, someone with sense. Will dragged a hand down his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Yeah, well, stopping wasn't really an option in the moment." Rilvek's four eyes narrowed in what might have been disbelief. "Your body was failing. Any rational being would have ceased immediately." "Humans don't always work like that," Will admitted. Velora snorted. Understatement of the year. Rilvek's mandibles clicked softly. "I do not understand." Will sighed and shifted against the pillows. "It's not just instinct. It's conditioning. You push through because sometimes stopping isn't an option. Back home, people train for endurance as much as skill." He gestured vaguely with his good hand. "Sometimes that means keeping yourself moving even when everything in you is screaming to stop." Rilvek was silent for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "That is troubling." Velora muttered something under her breath, but didn't interrupt. Will tilted his head toward Rilvek. "You think I wanted to keep going? My body was shutting down, but I had to push past it." Rilvek considered this, his mandibles twitching again. "But why?" Will hesitated, then shrugged with his good shoulder. "Because if I let pain dictate when I stopped, I'd never get anywhere." A flicker of something passed over Rilvek's face. He turned the thought over in his head, clearly unsettled. Velora exhaled sharply. "You're not leaving this med bay until I say so. And if I see you trying to test that arm before it's stable, I'll sedate you again." Will grimaced but didn't argue. He wasn't in a hurry to repeat that experience. Rilvek was still watching him, his expression unreadable. This is not normal for most species. Will let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I gathered." The silence stretched, charged with unspoken thoughts. Rilvek's posture remained rigid, but something in his stance had shifted. He wasn't just unsettled, he was re-evaluating. Velora finished her adjustments and straightened. "You'll heal, but you're benched for a while. Break that brace, and I'll make sure you regret it." Will lifted his good hand in surrender. "Noted." Velora glanced at Rilvek. "Take him back to his quarters when he's ready, and make sure he doesn't do anything stupid." Rilvek stiffened slightly, then inclined his head. Will sighed. This was going to be a long recovery. Will leaned against the doorframe of his quarters, his injured arm still strapped into the brace. The pain had dulled to a deep, persistent ache, but he was under strict orders not to push it. Velora's threat of sedation lingered as a very real possibility. Rilvek stood just inside the room, his posture stiff with something that wasn't quite discomfort but wasn't ease either. His four eyes flicked between Will and the brace, the tension in his movements betraying thoughts he hadn't voiced yet. Will exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "You're still thinking about it." Rilvek's mandibles shifted. "It is difficult not to." The silence stretched for a moment before Rilvek finally stepped further inside, his lower arms folding across his torso in what will recognized as a gesture of unease. I have trained with many species, Rilvek said after a pause, his tone measured. I have seen injuries occur in sparring sessions before, some more severe than yours. Yet, his mandibles twitched, his upper arms shifting slightly before stilling again. None of them reacted as you did. Will ran his good hand through his hair, watching Rilvek carefully. You still don't get why I kept going. Rilvek's gaze was unreadable, but his voice carried an undercurrent of something close to frustration. Understanding and accepting are not the same. Will huffed a quiet breath, pushing off the door frame and moving to sit on the edge of his bed. His body still felt drained, though he wasn't sure if it was from the injury or the weight of the conversation hanging between them. All right, then let me ask you something, Will said, resting his good arm on his knee. What would you have done if the situation were reversed? Rilvek stiffened slightly, his mandibles pressing together in thought. I would have stopped. Continuing would have risked further harm. Will nodded, unsurprised. Makes sense, but what if stopping wasn't an option? Rilvek's head tilted, his eyes narrowing slightly. Explain. Will shifted, adjusting the brace slightly before meeting Rilvek's gaze again. Say you were in a real fight, not just training. Say stopping meant losing something important in your life, someone else's, a mission that couldn't fail. What would you do then? Rilvek hesitated, and for the first time Will saw uncertainty creep into his expression. I would endure, Rilvek admitted after a long pause. But that is different. That is necessity. Will gave a small nod. For us, sometimes pushing through pain is necessity too. It's not always life or death, but it's how we're wired, how we train. If we stop the second something hurt too much, we wouldn't be able to handle the things that really matter when they happen. Rilvek's mandibles twitched. That is, he trailed off, searching for the right word. Difficult to process. Will exhaled a quiet laugh. Yeah, well, it's not exactly pleasant for us either. Rilvek regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he moved to sit across from Will, his posture still tense but his tone quieter than before. When I struck you, I did not think it would cause such harm, Rilvek admitted. Yet you continued as if the injury was secondary. That is what unsettles me. Will's fingers drummed absently against his knee. It wasn't secondary. Trust me, I felt every second of it. He took a breath, his gaze steady. But in the moment, I couldn't let it stop me. That's just how we are. Rilvek studied him, his mandibles shifting in thought. You choose to endure. Will nodded. Yeah, we choose to. The silence between them felt less strained now, though the weight of the conversation still lingered. After a moment, Rilvek's upper arms unfolded slightly, his posture losing some of its rigidness. I will need time to understand this. Will gave a tired grin. Take all the time you need. Just don't break any bones trying to figure it out. Rilvek's mandibles twitched, and for the first time since the fight, there was something almost like amusement in his expression. I will. Avoid that. Will leaned back slightly, exhaling. The pain in his arm was still there, but for once, it didn't feel like the hardest thing he was dealing with. Later, Will sat at the edge of his bed, carefully rotating his shoulder to test the limits of his movement. The brace restricted most of it, but he was getting used to the weight of it. The lingering ache in his bones was manageable, though Velra's strict orders to avoid unnecessary strain kept him from pushing further. Rilvek stood near the door, his posture less rigid than before, but still marked by a tension that hadn't faded since the incident. His four eyes tracked Will's movements with the same intense scrutiny he had carried since witnessing the injury. You are adjusting quickly, Rilvek observed. Will glanced up, lowering his arm back to his lap. I don't really have a choice. Rilvek's mandibles twitched slightly, a reaction Will had come to associate with thoughtfulness. I have continued my research on human physiology. Will leaned back slightly. That sounds ominous. Rilvek didn't acknowledge the joke. Your species' capacity for pain tolerance and endurance is inconsistent. Will arched a brow. Inconsistent. Rilvek shifted slightly, his arms adjusting in a way that suggested careful consideration. Some reports indicate extreme fragility in comparison to other species. Yet others suggest humans have endured injuries that should result in complete incapacitation. The disparity is difficult to reconcile. Will exhaled, considering his response. It depends on the person. Some people have higher pain tolerances, some don't. Training, conditioning, experience, it all plays a role. Rilvek's eyes narrowed slightly. Your endurance in the training hall was not solely biological. Will gave a short nod. No, it wasn't. Rilvek remained silent for a moment before stepping further into the room. I have spoken with others about what occurred. Many still do not understand why you continued fighting. Will ran his good hand over his face. Yeah, I figured. Rilvek hesitated, then said, some believe it was an act of recklessness. Will huffed a quiet breath. Not entirely wrong. Rilvek's mandibles pressed together briefly before he spoke again. Others believe it was an attempt to assert dominance. Will frowned. That's not what it was. Rilvek tilted his head slightly. Then explain it in terms they will understand. Will exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone but myself. It wasn't about dominance, it wasn't about pride. It was about control. If I let the injury dictate my actions in that moment, it would have meant letting something external decide my limits. Rilvek's gaze remained steady. And that is unacceptable to you. Will met his eyes. Sometimes, yeah. Rilvek considered this, his posture shifting subtly. This concept is foreign to many here. Pain is seen as a signal to stop, not something to push beyond. Will nodded. I get that. It makes sense. Humans just have a complicated relationship with pain. Rilvek's upper arms folded across his chest. That is an understatement. Will let out a quiet chuckle. Yeah, I guess it is. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried weight. Rilvek's expression remained unreadable, but there was no denying the intensity of his focus. Finally, Rilvek spoke again. Many do not know how to view you now. Will tilted his head. What do you mean? Rilvek's mandibles shifted slightly. Before, you were simply another student. Now you are something else, an anomaly. Will sighed, rubbing his forehead. Great. Rilvek's eyes narrowed slightly. You do not seem pleased by this. Will shook his head. I didn't come here to be a curiosity. I just wanted to learn, same as everyone else. Rilvek studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Then you must help them understand. Will scoffed. You say that like it's easy. Rilvek's mandibles twitched. It is not. But you have already begun. Will exhaled, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Yeah, I guess I have. A few days later, Will sat at the edge of the training hall, his injured arm still strapped in the brace. The usual hum of practice was subdued, and though no one was avoiding him outright, there was a hesitation in the air. He could feel their glances uncertain, wary. Rilvek stood nearby, arms crossed, his posture more at ease than before. Still, his gaze was sharp, calculating. He had been keeping an eye on Will since the injury, ensuring he didn't push himself too hard, not that he ever said it aloud. Finally, Pash, a Solari student with shifting blue skin, stepped forward. They hesitated before asking, do all humans have your kind of endurance, or are you unique? Will considered that. Humans vary, he said. Some can take more than others. Training, mindset, they make a difference. He glanced at his arm. I pushed harder than most would, not because I'm stronger, just because I was taught to keep going. Pash's expression was unreadable, but their stance shifted slightly. To many species, pain is a warning, a signal to stop. It is for us too, Will admitted, but sometimes stopping isn't an option. A reptilian student, Xoro, let out a slow breath. Some of us thought you were trying to prove something, that you kept fighting to show dominance. Their voice was careful, deliberate. Was it about pride? Will shook his head. No, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. He met Xoro's gaze. I kept going because I couldn't let the pain decide for me. If I stopped, it had already won. Xoro flicked their tail, considering that. I don't think I've ever met a species that thinks of pain that way. They studied him for a moment before adding, do humans just ignore it? Will exhaled. No. We feel it like anyone else, he paused, choosing his words carefully. We just don't always let it stop us. Some of us are trained to push past it not because we don't feel it, but because we've learned to keep functioning despite it. Pash murmured something to themselves, then looked back at him. So, humans don't just accept their limits, you test them. Will nodded. Pretty much. Rilvek finally spoke. That is why many still see you differently, he said. The way you reacted to your injury, it changed how they look at you. Some respect it, others find it. Unsettling, his mandibles twitched slightly. A few still don't know what to make of you. Will sighed. I didn't come here to be a curiosity. I came to learn, he glanced around. But I get why they see me that way. Exoro tilted their head. I don't understand why a species would willingly push themselves beyond what is natural. Will thought for a moment. Because sometimes survival depends on it, he shifted in his seat. Humans evolved to endure. We wouldn't have made it otherwise. More students had gathered now, listening. One asked, would you have stopped if the injury had been worse? Will hesitated. Depends. If I physically couldn't continue, then yeah. But if I had a choice, he shrugged, I probably would have kept going. Another student frowned. Do all humans think that way? No, Will admitted. Some do, some don't. We're not all the same. The tension in the room gradually faded as the conversation continued. The hesitation in their movements lessened, and though they still looked at him differently, something in their gazes had shifted. Understanding, if not agreement. When the discussion finally lulled, Rilvek made one last observation. Humans do not simply endure pain. They adapt to it. Will met his gaze, considering that. Then he nodded. Yeah, we do. Will adjusted the brace on his arm, rolling his shoulder carefully as he watched the training hall from a distance. The initial tension from the other students had faded, though a few still eyed him with wariness. Others, however, had become noticeably more open. Rilvek approached, his movements measured. He had been studying Will closely since their last conversation, though his questions had slowed. Instead of skepticism, his expression held something closer to contemplation. Will leaned against a nearby support beam, tilting his head slightly. You're thinking about something. Rilvek's mandibles shifted slightly before he responded. I have been reviewing various accounts of human endurance. The patterns are unsettling. Will gave a short laugh. You keep using that word. Rilvek's gaze remained steady. I have spoken with others. Some now view you with respect. Others remain uncertain. A few believe your actions were reckless rather than admirable. Will shrugged with his good shoulder. Sounds about right. Rilvek hesitated before continuing. You do not seem concerned by this. Will ran a hand through his hair. People are going to think what they think. It's not my job to make everyone comfortable with how humans handle things. Rilvek studied him for a moment before speaking again. You would not fight in the same way now, would you? Will glanced at the brace on his arm. I'd like to think I'd be a little smarter about it. Rilvek's mandibles twitched slightly. That is an encouraging development. Will chuckled. Glad to hear it. The students in the training hall had begun sparring again, their hesitation diminishing. Pash glanced in Will's direction but didn't say anything, instead turning back to their partner. Rilvek observed the shift in atmosphere. You are no longer seen as an anomaly. You are becoming a known variable. Will arched a brow. Is that a good thing? Rilvek considered before answering. It is preferable to being an unknown one. Will nodded. Fair enough. Another voice joined them, Exoro stepping closer. Their reptilian features were impassive, but their tail flicked slightly, a sign Will had come to recognize as interest. You are returning to training soon, Exoro stated. Will glanced at his arm. Once Velora clears me, yeah. Exoro studied him before speaking again. I would spar with you when that time comes. Will blinked. You're not worried about me doing something reckless again. Exoro's posture remained steady. I believe you have learned from the experience. Will let out a breath, nodding. Yeah, I think I have. By the time the discussion ended, Will felt something shift not just in how others saw him, but in how they interacted with him. He wasn't just the human who had pushed through an injury anymore. He was part of the training hall, part of the group. Rilvek's mandibles twitched again before he spoke. I believe I understand now. Will glanced at him. Yeah. Rilvek considered before responding. But I do not know if I would make the same choice in your place. Will gave a small smile. You don't have to. That's the thing about different species, we don't all have to handle things the same way. Rilvek inclined his head slightly. A reasonable perspective. Will pushed off the support beam. So we good. Rilvek's posture remained steady. Yes, we are good. Will grinned. Great. Now let's make sure I don't end up back in the med bay when I start training again. Rilvek's mandibles twitched. That would be advisable. Will laughed, and for the first time since the injury, it felt like things were settling into something normal. Maybe not the same as before, but something that worked. And that was enough.